We are having a free play discussion tonight about the Rings
What
of
does it
Power.
sound like when $1 billion burns?
Everything burns.
So of course, we are talking about the most recent attempt at doing a adaptation of J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings books and series. Instead of taking the idea and trying to build upon it, they said, okay, we're going to take a skin suit of something that kind of sort of has to do with this book, and then we're going to subvert expectations.
They're not buying the IPs anymore. They're only buying the audience. Because these people will watch this because it has the name Lord of the Rings. We're just going to tell our own story and kind of give it the Tolkien skin.
They should have called it Game of Rings, because that's what they want, Game of Thrones, and they're going to try to do it with Lord of the Rings.
Call it Lord of the Rings genocide, since everybody's asking, well, what happened to all these elves and dwarves 1,000 years later?
The Power of the Rings, Dark Fate.
When you mentioned the part about the what is all this happening 1,000 years later, Joe, I want you to go into more detail. Tell us a little bit about what was going on there.
Okay, well, as we all know with Tolkien, it's European mythology, and so most of the races that you find are European in his world setting. As a result, a lot of pale skin, a lot of white people running around. But they've decided that they want to make it look more like the world we live in now, which makes no sense because Middle Earth is not Earth. So I don't know where that comes from, but with the movies that we already have that go over Frodo's journey to destroy the One Ring, there's not a black dwarf, not a black elf in sight anywhere. And this new IP that they're working to put together with Tolkien's name slapped on it, which I'm sure he's really, really happy about. There's a lot of diverse elves and dwarves from what we've seen in the preview materials. So a lot of people have started asking the question, well, what happened to the diversity?
Because it's set centuries before the other story, so you're right, it does kind of beg that question. It's almost like if they had instead turned and done it like however many years afterwards or added another continent or something. Like you could at least have an explainer, but they decided to do it in the worst possible way to bring up these kind of questions.
I kind of consider it a joke at this point, but then there's also the whole, the Uruk-hai were believed to be elves once.
Don't go. It was orcs. It was the orcs were the corrupted elves.
Oh, that's right. The Uruk-hai were the ones that grew in the slime, right?
Sauron created the Uruk-hai. But I think there's enough of that in World of Warcraft where they talk about the orcs.
None of these are my opinions. These are just things that have been discussed in the big bad interwebs.
The show itself looks cheap. That's the crazy part. Amazon spent $1 billion just to get the rights to this. And then they're supposedly spending $25 million per episode, which means when you do $25 million per episode, I think it's going to be an 8-episode series. So you're talking about a $200 million budget. And it's not, some people think, oh, it's $25 million each episode. No, but that means you have a costume budget and a special effects budget, and then it gets spread out over the series. What amazes me is I looked it up, and even adjusted for inflation, I think the original Lord of the Rings movies had the equivalent of around like $225 million per movie budget adjusted for inflation. So this show has about the same budget as one of the Peter Jackson movies, and they can't get it to look good. I mean, the prologue...
Wasn't there something about them filming it in like 8K or some shit? And that's the reason it's just too crisp?
Well, that was when they did The Hobbit, right? When Peter Jackson went back and did The Hobbit, he did the high frame rate, 60 frame per second or whatever it was. I went and saw the first one in that. It doesn't look good. It makes it look like a theater play, like where you can tell how fake it is. So there is something to be said for 30, dropping it down to 30 frames or, 20 or whatever. So because the human eye needs something to, fill in the gap to kind of give it that mystery and magic when you're watching a movie. When it looks too crisp and too real, you can pick out the stuff. It reminds me, I got the Wizard of Oz on Blu-ray, and watching that in HD on like a really 4K high definition television, you're just like, wow, that is just felt on those people, and it just completely destroys like what you're watching. You're like, it was 1939. I guess that was the pinnacle of special effects, was getting some felt and, garbing people in it, but it just doesn't hold up once you see it in current graphics. It's still a good show, a good movie, but I think you're right that when they go too realistic with the stuff, you can tell that stuff is rubber.